These are methods which fulfills a particular component or step of policy making, which makes robust analysis of the choices of the cost benefit, or the strength or weaknesses, or the criteria, etc., etc. It evaluates many of those aspects. But eventually, in synthesizing evidence, there are one or more aim for synthesizing evidence for policy options. So synthesizing the methods for synthesizing evidence depends upon one or more of these aims. This is a good chart that summarizes the evidence synthesis methods. There's two dimensions. One is the synthesis in terms of evidence configuring, and the second part is synthesis in terms of aggregating the evidence. The first part talks about interpretation of largely during the synthesis to build a meaning. And the second dimension talks about the interpretation largely before and after synthesis to frame questions and use the findings from synthesis for policy options. It also have three steps. The first is generate, and the second is generate the evidence. Second is explore the evidence, and third is test the evidence for synthesizing the evidence. And the approaches or methods that are used, these are groups of methods. The first group of method is meta-ethnography methods. The second is thematic synthesis, theme-based analysis of evidence. The third is realistic synthesis or framework synthesis. There are also different types of review synthesis. It could be systematic reviews, it could be scoping review, or other types of review. Thematic summaries. Then the last is also content analysis and quantitative meta-analysis. So all of these broad approaches can be used in evidence synthesis. But of course, each of this synthesis process, the researchers or the policy analysts could use one or more of these evidence synthesis methods, mixed method also, the researcher can use, or policy analysts can use. This is a good pyramidal triangle that talks about the traditional evidence hierarchy for questions related to effectiveness of evidence synthesis on policy making. So it presents in terms of this triangle, pyramidal triangle. There are five methodological evidence base that it talks about. The number on top is the systematic review or meta-analysis. So that is the most the top one in terms of validity in evidence, using evidence base for synthesizing. Number two is RCTs, the randomized controlled trials, evidence from randomized controlled trials. That is the number two in terms of the hierarchy of questions related to the effectiveness of evidence synthesis. And the third is cohort studies. They're also very highly useful as effective methods for evidence synthesis questions. The fourth is case control studies. If you look at closely, I mean, case control study, there are only differences. If you take randomized control studies, there's more robust cohort studies. They also offer good form of cause and effect analysis, cause and effect conclusions. Case control studies also offer a fair, good methodology to for cause and effect evidence. And lastly, case series and reports, that is at the bottom. So these are the hierarchy of for research questions, evidence questions related to effectiveness of evidence synthesis. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Wait a minute. Yeah. So this, just hold on for a minute. This is a very comprehensive, what is called as a funnel, evidence creation funnel, which captures every aspect of evidence synthesis, policy making, all dimensions and components of evidence synthesis and policy making. It has three broad domains. The first one is evidence product. evidence products, that is tertiary research, which deals with, I think this talks about health policy making as a context. So the first is evidence briefs for policy, health technology assessment, patient decision aids, guidelines, etc. That is the tertiary part of evidence products. The second is evidence synthesis, that is secondary research, that is meta-analysis, systematic reviews, with or without reviews, with or without meta-analysis, qualitative reviews, rapid reviews, scoping reviews, modeling analysis, evidence and gap mapping analysis in terms of identifying gaps on the evidence. For example, the burden of disease study is a good foundation for evidence-based policy in health policy making. And the third domain talks about evidence inquiry, which relies on primary research, collecting data, evidence synthesis in terms of data from primary data collection. So this could be any of the primary methods of data collection: experimental studies, observational studies, qualitative studies, public health surveillance studies, even social or economic surveillance data, national surveys, routine data, implementation of research for a particular topic, focused topic, behavioral research, monitoring and evaluation. This is a very beautiful summary of the evidence creation funnel. It takes a very comprehensive picture of both the policy analysis method and the evidence synthesis methods and the range of evidences at three levels, tertiary, secondary, and primary research levels. And that it also detail all aspects of data sources and all aspects of data collection. Really very nice way of understanding the evidence funnel for evidence synthesis. So as researchers on policy analysis, I think we are familiar with the many aspects of these methods or data sources, not necessarily all of them. But if we have expertise and skills in some of these and that or many of these, that would really be the foundation or very useful for evidence-based policy making and evidence synthesis. So what are evidence synthesis methods? We discussed what are those that we just look at the methods, but in detail, what specifically are these methods? For example, meta-ethnography, the method in terms of method, is a method for reviewing ethnographic data or other qualitative data, studies data, using methods similar to ethnographic analysis of primary research data, observations, extract, concepts, metaphors, themes arising from different studies, then interpreting and synthesizing these into a storyline of argument for policy. Realistic review and synthesis is a method of synthesis, evidence synthesis, that seeks to populate an explicit program theory to provide an explanatory analysis aimed at discerning what works for whom and in what circumstances and in what respects and how. The third aspect is narrative review or synthesis, is a term used in three different ways to describe traditional non-systematic literature, reviews that synthesize words, text, that is in terms of contents rather than numbers. Third is a specific approach of narrative explanation in research synthesis. These are the first three broad range of synthesis methods. And there are also mixed method synthesis for effective policy making. Also remember that when we talked about all of those, it also, when in this type of synthesis, each of these, it also takes into account available data from based on any type of data collection methods that we discussed in terms of the evidence funnel. Now, in terms of mixed method synthesis for effective policy making, decision makers need to address complicated questions about the nature and significance of the problem to be addressed, the nature of the proposed interventions, the differential impact of the intervention, the cost effectiveness of the intervention, and the acceptability of the intervention, and etc. If you look at closely, a lot of issues are involved, a lot of aspects are considered. So it means that the researcher already has collected data, has large amount of research evidence. He has already conducted cost-effective analysis and then evaluated the impact analysis, etc. And then he is at a time now to synthesize the evidence using one or more of the methods of evidence synthesis. The complexity inherent in this description suggests that multiple review methods taking multiple perspectives into account may be needed to address complicated policy questions. Today, policymakers live in complex policy world and needs to solve complex policy questions. So always needs the researcher or policy analyst need to take into consideration multiple perspectives into account to be able to propose a very robust policy conclusion. This understanding is supported by Noyes and colleagues and by Horton and other colleagues who argue for the value of combining both qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method synthesis with quantitative reviews for effectiveness. Together, these authors' arguments suggest that addressing a research question through quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method synthesis can contribute to, in this case, health policy decision making, whether it is a social policy or economic policy or any aspect of policy, the decision making by going beyond that one particular issue. Another aspect that needs to be considered in evidence synthesis is stratification. Inequalities and inequities, I think, is always a matter of concern in policy making, in addressing policy issues. Social disadvantage and vulnerability are complex issues. This is where I said policy making and policy context is always complex, because when a policymaker is taking an initiative to launch a policy, he has to address many concerns, including inequalities and inequities and issues like social disadvantage, vulnerabilities, etc. These are complex issues that require broad evidence-based drawing on various social, political, cultural, ethical perspectives, but also large amount of evidence, stratified evidence is necessary to be able to make a very robust policy conclusion. Potentially relevant studies may thus be found in wide range of literature, for example, on stratification, published literature, government documents, etc. So one has to look for the extensive literature search to find out, look for stratifications. When developing such strategy for equity sensitive health policy system review synthesis, reviewers or information specialists should purposely identify various information sources and databases relevant to health equity. This is an example of health equity, but this applies to social equity or other aspects of policy, often beyond the health sector. For example, in sociology, economics, political science, or political policy, whatever realm of the policy. So equity sensitive evidence synthesis often put forth subgroups, subcategories, and sensitivity analysis as the core in the analysis to price the influence of health policies and health systems interventions across different states of the population. This is a very important component